This week, the world is once again turning its attention to Ukraine. On the table lies a new peace plan that, far from ending the war, could redefine Europe's political map. On the surface, it promises a ceasefire and a pathway to end the conflict. In reality, it opens the door to territorial concessions, a frozen front line, and a deeper Russian influence at the heart of the continent. For Kyiv, the issue is not just what gets signed, but what it would legitimize. The notion that a nuclear power can redraw borders by force and then dictate the terms of the settlement. Ukraine's central concern is that this plan does not ensure security or sovereignty, but instead entrenches aggression. Behind the diplomatic language lies a very real fear that the true price of peace could be the country's own independence. Behind the diplomatic language and carefully worded statements, the so-called peace plan demands commitments that would fundamentally reshape Europe's security architecture. Its core elements revolve around three pillars: territory, military conditions, and political obligations. On the territorial front, the plan would require Ukraine to acknowledge the loss of regions occupied by Russia since 2014 and 2022, effectively legitimizing Moscow's presence in areas that remain highly contested. This is not a mere border adjustment. It is the acceptance that military force can rewrite maps. Militarily, the document calls for severe restrictions on Ukraine's defensive capabilities, from limits on the types of weapons it may possess to bans on key strategic infrastructure in the country's east. Under these conditions, Ukraine would be left with a significantly reduced defensive margin, while Russia would retain forward positions just across the line. The third pillar is political. The plan pressures Kyiv to adopt a posture of forced neutrality, which in practice could close the door to the European Union and NATO. It also opens the possibility for Moscow to gain oversight or leverage over certain internal policies, especially in the realm of security. What does Russia gain if it is signed? Territorial recognition, a militarily weakened Ukraine, and an indirect veto over its geopolitical orientation. What does Ukraine gain? A fragile ceasefire with no guarantees that Russia will not advance again when conditions suit its interests. This is the part almost no one explains. The plan doesn't just stop the war, it redraws the balance of power in Europe, and it does so in Moscow's favor. For many outside observers, the idea of territory for peace may sound pragmatic, yielding occupied areas in exchange for halting the fighting. But for Ukraine, this concept represents an extremely dangerous precedent. It not only reframes the current war, but also opens the door for other actors to use military force as a legitimate tool for redrawing borders. Historically, agreements of this kind have carried profound consequences. In Europe, the territorial appeasement of the 1930s proved that concessions do not curb the ambitions of revisionist powers. They merely buy time for them to rearm. In Russia's case, accepting a trade of territory for peace would validate its strategy: invade first, negotiate later. For Moscow, it would confirm that military pressure works. And not just for Russia, China is watching closely. For Beijing, such an arrangement would illustrate that democracies can be pushed into negotiating from a position of weakness, especially in potential crises over Taiwan or the South China Sea. For Ukraine, this precedent would also shape every future negotiation. If the world accepts that it can lose regions under military threat, why would Russia stop repeating the tactic? The next crisis would begin with a structural advantage for Moscow. It would already know that the international community is willing to sacrifice Ukrainian territory to avoid escalation. And this directly impacts Ukraine's diplomacy. Kyiv would be left with less leverage, less credibility, and fewer tools to demand real security guarantees. The message to its allies would also be troubling. Support for Ukraine has limits. and those limits appear just when Russia applies maximum pressure. For Kyiv, this is not a settlement. It is a precedent that weakens European security for an entire generation. When people talk about a peace plan, they imagine borders changing on a map. But for Ukraine, the real losses go far beyond lines drawn on paper. What Kyiv fears most is losing entire regions that took generations to build. Cities like Mariupol or Severodonetsk weren't just urban centers, they were engines of industry. Steel plants, power stations, rail hubs, and logistics corridors that once fueled the national economy would remain permanently outside Ukraine's control. Rebuilding that capacity somewhere else would take decades, and billions of dollars Ukraine simply doesn't have. But the loss isn't only physical. These territories are home to millions of Ukrainians, families, workers, children, many of whom will never return. Some cities are destroyed. Others remain under occupation. And for a nation already facing one of Europe's fastest population declines, this demographic shock is a wound that may never heal. Then comes the economic core. The Donbass is more than a battlefield. It is Ukraine's industrial heartland. Coal mines, metallurgy plants, machinery factories, assets that once kept the country self-sufficient. If these areas are surrendered under a peace deal, Ukraine becomes more dependent on foreign aid, more vulnerable to economic pressure, and less capable of sustaining a modern industry. And the losses continue toward the sea. With Mariupol and Berdyansk under Russian control, the Sea of Azov has effectively become a Russian lake. Ukraine's maritime access shrinks, its export routes narrow, and its influence in the Black Sea is weakened. A country without secure ports becomes a country with a fragile economic future. But perhaps the deepest cost isn't territorial or industrial. It's psychological. Accepting such a peace would leave a permanent scar inside Ukraine. A sense of forced defeat that could divide politics, weaken institutions, and fracture society for a generation. And at the same time, it would send a dangerous message to Moscow. That pressure works, and that future concessions might only be a matter of time. For Kyiv, this is the part no one sees at first glance. A peace plan that promises stability, but carries losses that could shape the country's destiny long after the war. On the surface, a peace plan sounds like a compromise, but when you look closely, it becomes clear why this proposal benefits Russia far more than anyone is willing to say out loud. First, the plan would freeze the current lines of occupation exactly where they are today. Without taking another step, Moscow would keep every territory it controls, territories it captured through force, destruction, and months of grinding warfare. No further advance needed, and no diplomatic cost attached. In practice, this means Russia would receive international recognition of its gains, something the Kremlin has failed to secure since 2014. For Moscow, that alone is a strategic victory. Borders redrawn not by negotiation, but by endurance. But the second advantage is even deeper. A frozen conflict gives Russia what it needs most: time. Time to rebuild its army, replace equipment, expand production lines, and prepare for whatever comes next. A Russia that pauses the war is not a Russia that abandons its ambitions. It is a Russia that simply reloads. A third benefit is the impact on Europe. By accepting this kind of agreement, the West signals division, some countries pushing for negotiations, others warning of a dangerous precedent. And nothing strengthens Moscow more than a divided NATO, especially when that division is over how to respond to Russian aggression. Unity has been Ukraine's shield. Fracture is Russia's opportunity. And then there is the economic angle. A frozen conflict reduces the immediate financial pressure on Moscow. Energy revenues continue flowing. Trade slowly creeps back through indirect routes. Sanctions fatigue grows in Europe. And the Russian economy gains a period of stabilization, enough to adapt, reorganize, and reorient itself toward Asia. In the Kremlin's view, this peace plan is not the end of the conflict. It is a strategic pause that locks in territorial gains, weakens NATO cohesion, lowers economic pressure, and gives Russia the breathing room it needs to prepare for the next phase of this geopolitical struggle. This is what almost no one is explaining. A peace that stops the fighting can still be a victory for the one who caused it. A deep fear within the European Union. If Ukraine views the plan as dangerous, several European countries see it as a direct threat. For the Baltic states and Poland, Kyiv's strongest allies, a territorial settlement imposed from the outside would send a devastating message. Europe is willing to accept military force as a legitimate tool for altering borders. For them, who share both history and frontiers with Russia, this precedent is not abstract. It is existential. A quick agreement, pushed by actors eager to end the conflict to ease economic and political pressures at home, could fracture the European Union. While Central and Northern Europe insist on resisting Russian aggression at all costs, other governments, more concerned with energy prices, trade, and social fatigue, might favor a pragmatic closure. The result would be a deep divide, a Europe split between those who prioritize long-term security and those who prioritize immediate stability. Doubts about the continuity of Europe's military support are also growing. If the agreement freezes the war, many parliaments could argue that sending weapons or large-scale financing to Ukraine is no longer necessary. This would leave Kyiv extremely vulnerable without the capacity to reclaim territory or defend against future offensives. Because the risk does not end with the signing. On the contrary, a settlement favorable to Moscow could encourage Russia to repeat this strategy elsewhere. Moldova, Georgia, and even strategic regions in the Baltics fear that an emboldened Russia could exploit weak responses to advance its territorial agenda step by step. At its core, Europe's fear is not only for Ukraine, it is for the stability of the continent itself. If this plan becomes a precedent, Europe may enter an era where collective security is no longer a guarantee, but a gamble. The way the conflict in Ukraine is resolved will not only redefine Europe's borders, it will also reshape the future of NATO. Within the alliance, a growing fear has taken hold that accepting a peace plan built on imposed concessions would signal weakness to adversaries and allies alike. If a large-scale act of aggression can result in territorial gains, the message to the world is unmistakable. Even the most powerful military alliance on the planet has limits. The impact on Article 5, the cornerstone of NATO, would be profound. Although Ukraine is not a member, the perception that the alliance is allowing a European country to be pressured into surrendering territory would undermine the credibility of collective defense. Moscow could interpret this outcome as evidence that NATO avoids risk at all costs, potentially testing the alliance's resolve in the Baltic states or Poland. The plan also threatens NATO's internal strategic cohesion. Eastern flank members, whose survival depends on a firm stance, find themselves at odds with governments farther from the front, whose priority is to avoid escalation with Russia. This fracture is not theoretical. It is already visible in debates over weapons deliveries, funding, and military presence. Finally, a quiet but persistent concern is emerging: that the United States may be preparing a transition in which the burden of European security shifts increasingly onto Europe itself. If Washington views the agreement as a way to stabilize the conflict without deeper involvement, the military and financial load could fall onto European allies, who lack both the coordination and the resources to fill that gap alone. Taken together, this plan does more than reshape Ukraine. It redefines the architecture of Atlantic security. The hidden truth. Behind official statements and carefully measured diplomacy lies a series of fears that Ukraine rarely dares to express openly. Not because they aren't real, but because admitting them could weaken its position at a critical moment. The first is the fear of being betrayed by its own allies. Kyiv knows that several Western governments face internal pressures, economic costs, political fatigue, social tensions. Ukraine lives with the constant worry that, at some point, its partners may decide to prioritize European stability over Ukraine's survival. And if that day comes, Kyiv would be left alone. Added to this is the fear of losing financial support. The country depends on billions in assistance to sustain its economy, infrastructure, and defense. A deal that freezes the war could become an excuse to cut aid, leaving Ukraine trapped between incomplete reconstruction and an enemy that has not withdrawn. Another deep concern is that the proposed peace may amount to nothing more than a 12 to 24-month pause. Such an artificial truce would allow Russia to rearm, reorganize, and prepare for an even more aggressive phase of the conflict. Kyiv fears the world may mistake a temporary ceasefire for a real solution. And finally, the greatest fear of all, that the agreement will not end the war, but open the door to a larger one. That a newly emboldened Russia, empowered by a favorable precedent, will push further, with even bigger objectives. A post-agreement conflict that would be more brutal and far harder to contain. These are the truths Ukraine does not state publicly, not for lack of clarity, but because it knows the world is not ready to hear them.
Я ніколи її не зраджу. Національний український інтерес має бути врахований. Ми не робимо гучних заяв, ми будемо спокійно працювати з Америкою та усіма партнерами. Буде конструктивний пошук рішень з нашим головним партнером. Я буду наводити аргументи, я буду переконувати, пропонувати альтернативи, але точно ми не дамо ворогу приводів сказати, що це Україна не хоче миру, що це вона зриває процес і це Україна не готова до дипломатії.
What if Ukraine accepts or rejects the plan? Scenario A. If Ukraine accepts. If Ukraine were to accept the proposed plan, the political cost would be enormous. Kyiv would have to justify why it agreed to a deal that does not guarantee full sovereignty, risks normalizing territorial losses, and could be seen domestically as a concession made under pressure. Such a decision would freeze the conflict rather than resolve it, locking Ukraine into a precarious status where peace is temporary and the threat of renewed aggression remains alive. In this scenario, Russia would celebrate a strategic victory. Even without conquering all its objectives, Moscow would achieve something invaluable, proving that it can alter borders by force and withstand Western pressure long enough to impose political conditions. This outcome would fracture Europe, generating divisions between those who support the compromise and those who see it as an unacceptable appeasement. The internal debate would weaken the EU's strategic cohesion and raise uncomfortable questions about the future of European security. Scenario B, if Ukraine rejects. If Kyiv rejects the plan, the war will continue with no clear end in sight. This path keeps Ukraine's strategic goals intact, but it also deepens uncertainty about future Western support. Some allies may view the refusal as unrealistic, given battlefield conditions. Others may reaffirm their commitment but struggle politically or financially to maintain long-term aid. Diplomatic pressure would intensify as countries push Ukraine to consider realistic alternatives, especially if the conflict drags on through another winter. The coming months would carry significant risks: ammunition shortages, shifts in US or European politics, and the possibility that Russia escalates militarily to force Ukraine back to the negotiating table. Rejecting the plan preserves Ukraine's principles, but it also means entering a period of heightened danger, military, political, and diplomatic. Peace is a comforting word. It suggests stability, the end of fear, the closing of a painful chapter. But in geopolitics, peace is not always peace. And sometimes, a map that looks stable is only the beginning of a much larger conflict. So we must ask ourselves, what kind of peace is being offered? A peace that protects a nation's future, or a peace that simply freezes its suffering in place? And what happens when borders are changed not by dialogue, but by force? Does that create lasting peace, or invite the next crisis? Ukraine now faces choices without good answers. Its leaders must weigh geography, power, and history, knowing that every decision carries consequences far beyond the battlefield. And we, as observers of this moment, must reflect too. Is a quick peace worth the long-term risks it creates for Europe, for global stability, and for the generations that will inherit the outcome? In the end, one truth remains. Peace is not just the absence of war. It is the presence of security, justice, and freedom. Without those, peace becomes only a pause, and the calm before another storm. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Leave your reflections below, subscribe to the Geography channel for more geopolitical explorations, and share this video to expand the discussion. See you next time in our ongoing journey through history, power, and place.